cảm ơn tất cả các bạn đã có mặt tại Book Hunter ngày hôm nay. Một ngày hơi mưa một chút. Hôm nay thì rất là vui vì có Peter Kuznick và Tom Wilber là hai tác giả của Peter là tác giả của cuốn Nước Mình Chưa Được Kể, còn Tom Wilber là tác giả của cuốn Tù binh bất đồng chính kiến. Hai bác thì đợt này là sang theo lời mời của Việt Nam, của tham gia một cái sự kiện của các hội sử gia bên Học viện Ngoại giao. Để ngày mai là các bác đã về nước, thế thì nhân dịp đó thì có ghé qua Book Hunter để có một cuộc chia sẻ nho nhỏ cùng với lại cộng đồng độc giả. Thì hôm nay cũng khá là ngẫu hứng, nên là hôm nay chúng ta sẽ tổ chức một cái cuộc trao đổi một cách thoải mái. Trong đó thì tôi có chuẩn bị một số những cái câu hỏi Q&A cho hai tác giả ở đây, và cuối buổi thì các bạn cũng có thể đặt bất cứ một câu hỏi nào, và tôi hy vọng rằng là có thể đóng vai trò làm dịch giả để có thể truyền tải được với những bạn mà có thể tiếng Anh chưa được tốt thì ý tưởng của hai bác và các câu hỏi của các bạn dành cho hai tác giả. So I just introduce a little bit about our session today. So it's great to have you today, Peter Kuznick and Tom Wilber. First, I think you can say something about yourself with the audience here today. Maybe Tom?
So, hello, my name is Tom Wilber, and I'm here in large part because of the publishing work that Book Hunter has done for us in producing Vietnamese translation of this book here that I co-authored in the U.S. in 2021. And I'm an independent researcher. I'm not an academic. I have a couple of master's degrees, but they're not academic, really. And my life experience is been as a career naval officer, as been executive for a Fortune 500 company in the U.S. and as a management consultant. But my interest in Vietnam goes back to when I was a teenager, and my father was a pilot, captured pilot, from 1968 to 1973 in the prison system here in Hanoi. So I always had an interest and a love for Vietnam, inspired mostly by, believe it or not, what he called his love for Vietnam while he was a prisoner. So a little bit of an unusual experience. So, but that's who I am.
Okay. Dạ vâng. Thomas Wilber, hay gọi ngắn là Tom Wilber, thì đã qua lại Việt Nam chắc phải vài chục lần, rất là có duyên với Việt Nam. Cái duyên nó đến từ việc là người cha của bác là một phi công và bị bắn máy bay bị rơi bị bắt làm tù binh Mỹ và bị giam giữ ở Việt Nam một thời gian dài. Sau đó thì được thả ra, và trong toàn bộ thời gian đó thì khi mà về nước thì gặp một số trục trặc trở lại ở trong nước vì cái quá trình mà phản chiến của bố bác ấy. Và trong quá trình đó thì bác Tom đã theo dõi từ hồi còn nhỏ đến lúc lớn và quyết định là viết một cuốn sách về những người tù binh tương tự như bố Tom và cùng nói lên cái tiếng nói là phản đối chiến tranh. Bên cạnh đó thì bác Tom làm một cái nghề chính tư vấn, tức là cái nghề chủ yếu là ngày xưa là lính hải quân và sau đó tư vấn tài chính cho các tập đoàn của bên Mỹ. Okay, thank you, Tom. And Peter?
Hi, everybody. My name is Peter Kuznick. I'm a professor of history and director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University in Washington, D.C. My involvement with Vietnam goes back to high school. I had been very active in the anti-racism movement, the civil rights movement, in junior high school and high school. But then when I was in high school, I started to hear about the U.S. invasion of Vietnam. And when I was in college, my first semester, I started an anti-war group on campus. And I was very, very involved in the anti-war movement. After that, I went to graduate school. First, I spent a couple of years hitchhiking around the United States and Europe. Then I went back to graduate school and was in and out. And after I wrote my dissertation, I got lucky and I got a nice teaching job at American University. My first book was about scientists, about the politicization and radicalization of American scientists in the 1930s. And that led to my research about the atomic bomb. And in 1995, one of my favorite students, her grandfather had been killed in Hiroshima, and her mother and her grandmother survived the atomic bombings in Hiroshima. Maybe I'm going too much and you want to... You're okay?
Yeah,
And so, for the 50th anniversary of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, No and I decided we were going to do something special to commemorate. And that's when we started my Nuclear Studies Institute. And there was going to be a big exhibit at the Smithsonian in the United States about the dropping of the atomic bomb. But it got canceled because there was too much protest. The United States was not ready to deal with the real history of the atomic bombings. So we brought students over to Hiroshima and Kyoto from American University. And then it was going to be a one-year nuclear institute, but then we continued it, and I brought students to Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and Kyoto for the next 25 or more years. So I've been very involved with nuclear issues and the discussion, debate over the atomic bombings. But I'm also very involved in the anti-nuclear movement now. And so I go around the world and do a lot of Well, the other thing I should say is back in 2007, my friend Oliver Stone, the filmmaker, and I don't know if you know Oliver Stone's movies now. He's a very famous American filmmaker who made 3 very interesting movies about Vietnam. When Oliver was a student at Yale, he dropped out of Yale University and volunteered for combat in Vietnam. He was very patriotic. He was wounded twice and decorated for bravery. And he went back to the United States and he made the first realistic Vietnam War movie called Platoon. I don't know if you've ever seen Platoon.
Very famous.
Yeah,
Very
around the world very famous. But has it shown much in Vietnam?
Sometime before. But if the people who know about the wars with the US, Platoon is just like a overstone. That means open for another chapter of ideas about Vietnam in the United States.
It's a very realistic movie. And if you watch it, you can feel the jungle. And you can feel the fact that you have no idea what's around the corner. Most war movies have the Americans over here, and then whoever we're fighting over here, and the sides are really obvious. But as Chuck knows, war is much more chaotic than that. And that's what Oliver was able to convey. And he also showed the brutality of the United States in that movie. He made a second movie called Born on the 4th of July. And that's the story of Ron Kovic. And Ron was also a Marine and patriotic, and he got shot in the chest. And he got paralyzed from the chest down. And it's a movie about how he became very politically conscious and very strong critic of the war. Then Oliver made a third movie called Heaven and Earth. And the protagonist there is Layli Haislip, who was a Vietnamese woman, and it talks about her working with the Viet Cong, but then marrying an American and coming to live in the United States. and lately still lives in California. And Ron Kovic and lately Hayslip speak in my class often. And Oliver is my close friend. And so in 2007, Oliver was going to make a movie called Pinkville about the My Lai massacre. And he came to Washington to scout locations, and we had dinner together. And during dinner, he said, "Peter, let's do it. Let's do a documentary." And I was on sabbatical, so I thought we could do it that year. And then I went to see him 2 weeks later, and he had now an idea for a 10-hour, 10-part documentary film series. It was called The Untold History of the United States. It's a history of the American empire and national security state. But during the process, I convinced him that we couldn't say enough in 10 hours of documentary, and we had to add the book. And so we added, and then we updated it, and it aired. The book was a New York Times bestseller for 7 weeks, and the documentaries aired on Showtime and on Netflix and all over the world. So since that time, I've been very busy. I do a lot of speaking all over the world, and I do about 250 television interviews every year. So China, Russia, India, Japan, United Kingdom, but they almost never invite me in the United States. Anybody who's got my ideas is not allowed on American television. But the same thing with Howard Zinn, the same thing with Noam Chomsky, same thing with Dan Ellsberg, till he was dying. Then they had some attention to Dan. So in the United States, the press is free, which means that you can say whatever you want, but if you have views that are outside the mainstream, you don't get invited on. And so that's a little bit frustrating. So, but then Chuck introduced me to Nam, and Nam published our book in Vietnamese. So our book is out in about 22 languages. But I was very, very happy, and Oliver was very happy to have a Vietnamese edition. But Nam says it is too big and too complicated. So we're going to put out another edition based on the documentaries, and that'll be going to be smaller and easier to follow, I think.
Thank you, Peter. Khá là dài. Cơ bản là mình sẽ không dịch toàn bộ lại, mà hầu hết mọi người đây cũng khá là biết tiếng Anh. Mình chỉ tóm tắt một chút cho đến người ta bị miss đoạn đầu thôi. Thì Peter hiện tại là đang làm giáo sư tại Đại học American và làm giám đốc của một cái trung tâm gọi là Viện Nghiên cứu Hạt nhân. Thì cái duyên của Peter khá là dài, bởi vì hồi sinh viên là ông đã bắt đầu đi phản chiến và sau đó đi dạy học. Thì từ cái việc dạy học đó thì có duyên với lại rất nhiều những cái hoạt động khác liên quan đến nghiên cứu, rồi làm phim, rồi các phong trào phản chiến. Tại vì phong trào phản chiến hồi Mỹ chiến tranh Việt Nam thì nó diễn ra rất là mạnh ở các trường đại học. Thì sau đó thì Peter cũng có liên quan đến những cái hoạt động liên quan đến tưởng niệm ném bom hạt nhân ở Nhật, thì cũng làm những cái bảo tàng, rồi những cái triển lãm. Nhưng mà hồi đấy thì cũng rất nhiều khó khăn vì Mỹ họ cũng không muốn thừa nhận cái ném bom hạt nhân. Sau đó thì gặp Oliver Stone, cũng là một nhân vật quan trọng mà chúng ta chưa được gặp ở đây. Oliver Stone thì lại là một cựu chiến binh ở Việt Nam, ở tham chiến Việt Nam, cũng bị thương, cũng bị thương 2 lần. Và khi mà ông trở về Mỹ thì ông có làm phim về Việt Nam, và 3 bộ phim về Việt Nam rất là nổi tiếng, cũng đóng vai trò rất là quan trọng trong cái việc là khiến cho người Mỹ hiểu về chiến tranh Việt Nam. Bởi cái nhận thức về chiến tranh Việt Nam ở bên Mỹ nó rất là có những cái thay đổi. Và tình cờ thì Oliver bắt đầu quen Peter, đến tham dự cái khóa mà Peter dạy. Thì hai ông bắt đầu mới kết hợp với nhau và làm một cái tác phẩm là cái cuốn Nước Mỹ chuyện chưa kể. Trước đó thì cũng định làm một số cuốn liên quan đến thảm sát Mỹ Lai. Thì cái cuốn Nước Mỹ chuyện kể là cuốn quan trọng nhất của hai ông cùng làm với nhau.
one thing?
Yes, please.
Two things. And I met Tain back in the 1990s. I think it was the 1990s when...
88.
88, wow, the very early 1990s. Tain was working in the Vietnamese embassy in Washington, D.C. We became very good friends with Tain and his wife Lan, and they had two very young children who are now grown up. And I met Chuck, I think it was 2007, maybe it was earlier. But I brought students to Vietnam for the first time in 2007. And I know for sure that Chuck assisted us, and we went out to Quang Tri province to see Project Renew and the work that they were doing in Quang Tri back then. And that trip was very special for a lot of reasons, but partly because I brought Dan Ellsberg with us. And you might know Dan Ellsberg. He's America's most famous whistleblower, we call it. He released the Pentagon Papers, which was Robert McNamara's secret history of the U.S. invasion of Vietnam. And Dan Ellsberg got arrested, and he was facing 115 years in prison for releasing the Pentagon Papers. But I brought him with us. It was the first time Dan had been back to Vietnam since the 1960s. So it was very special. We got to meet with Madame Binh. We got invited to the home of General Giap. I met General Giap's wife and all of his children and grandchildren. So that was very special back in 2007. And we also met and spent time with Chuck in 2007. And so since then I've followed all the good work that Chuck has done as a Vietnam vet, trying to form friendships between the Americans and the Vietnamese, and also to make up for some of America's, the consequences of America's crimes against the Vietnamese people.
Cái cuộc chiến giữa Việt Nam và Hoa Kỳ thì nó để lại rất là nhiều hậu quả, và trong khi đó thì cái quá trình mà bình thường hóa quan hệ của hai nước thì nó cũng trải qua rất nhiều khó khăn. Trong đó thì bác Peter cũng có quen bác Thanh ngồi ở kia. Bác Thanh là một nhân vật cũng quan trọng trong Bộ Ngoại giao ở bên Mỹ, đóng vai trò suốt cái quá trình bình thường hóa quan hệ. Thì hai bác có quen biết nhau và tình bạn cũng khá là lâu, đến tận bây giờ. Đến năm 2007 thì bác Peter có đưa ông Daniel Ellsberg, ông ấy là một nhân vật rất là quan trọng, mà là người mà tiết lộ cái tập tài liệu Lò Năm Góc liên quan đến cái kế hoạch chiến tranh tại Việt Nam, mà khiến cho cuộc chiến, khiến cho nước Mỹ đã bắt đầu có nhiều bí mật bị lộ ra và cuộc chiến nó thay đổi. Và năm 2007 thì Peter đưa ông Daniel Ellsberg qua Việt Nam, có gặp bà Nguyễn Thị Bình và đại tướng Võ Nguyên Giáp và trao đổi. Từ đó thì bác Peter quay lại một lần nữa năm 2009, và đến tận lần này lần thứ 3 thì cái vai trò của Peter trong cái quá trình các phong trào phản chiến và cái đóng góp trong các trình bình thường hóa quan hệ Việt Nam và Hoa Kỳ rất là lớn trong khi đó. Và hôm nay thì chúng ta sẽ có thể cùng nhau trao đổi với lại hai tác giả về cái chủ đề đấy là chiến tranh của hòa bình. Thì cái chủ đề nó cũng khá là tổng quát, chứ chúng ta không giới hạn trong chiến tranh ở Việt Nam, mà chúng ta bàn về một cái tổng quát hơn, đấy là cái vai trò của mỗi người dân trong cái việc quyết định cái việc chiến tranh hòa bình nó như thế nào, chúng ta phải làm gì. Thì câu hỏi đầu tiên tôi sẽ hỏi ông Peter. So Peter, can you tell us about the present global situation now, and how close are we in a broader war? Thì câu hỏi đầu tiên là mình hỏi về cái tình hình hiện tại mà có lẽ đang khá là căng thẳng tại Trung Đông cũng như là tại Ukraine.
I just got back from a conference in San Francisco. The day the American Historical Association met in San Francisco, and I gave a talk titled about the two Cold Wars. The first Cold War, which officially ended in 1991, and the current Cold War, which officially started in 1990. I mean, we didn't have much of a break between the first Cold War and the second Cold War.
2020? The second in 2020?
1990.
There's an overlap. It's
I
important.
mean, the Cold War should have ended and we should have had a period of peace. But unfortunately, in 1990, when Gorbachev allowed the unification of Germany, George H.W. Bush and Dietrich Genscher and a lot of the other leaders all promised that if he allowed the unification of Germany, then NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east. That was the promise that Russia got. However, before 1990 was even finished, they were planning to expand NATO. And the NATO expansion started officially in 1997, with Hungary, Poland, and Czechoslovakia becoming part of NATO. This got Yeltsin and all the Russian leaders very angry. But they were weak in the 1990s after the collapse of communism. And so Putin does not make a big issue out of it until 2007 at his speech at the Munich Security Conference. And there he said that what the United States is doing is terrible, that this expansion of NATO is not acceptable, and people started to talk then about the new Cold War. Also, in 2008, George W. Bush says he's going to fast-track NATO expansion to Ukraine and Georgia. The U.S. ambassador to Russia at the time was William Burns. William Burns is now the CIA director, and Burns writes a confidential memo to Washington titled, "Niet means niet. Don't cross Russia's red lines. Don't expand NATO." But the United States ignored that. And in 2008, the government of Georgia sends troops into the breakaway republic of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and the Russians invade Georgia. Then in 2014, we have the Maidan uprising, and leads to the Russians take Crimea and support the rebellious forces in Luhansk and Donetsk, and the fighting starts then. The other Cold War is between the US and China, and that one begins really in October of 2011, when Hillary Clinton writes an article in Foreign Policy magazine titled "America's Pacific Century," saying the United States is going to pivot away from the Middle East toward China and Asia. And we're going to send our troops there and our ships, and we're going to stop China. The United States was already concerned about Chinese power and influence and trade, because the Chinese economy had grown at the fastest rate of any economy in history, many times faster than the Americans and the British. And what the American leaders saw was competition from China for who's going to be the dominant influence in Asia. And so the United States begins what they call the Asia pivot. And that's part of this process of militarization. And so the United States now is building 4 new bases in the Philippines. Japan is doubling its military spending. The United States began AUKUS with Australia and the United Kingdom and the United States, the Quad, including India, and is trying very hard to bring Vietnam to support the US policy against China. Well, there are 2 big issues with China right now. One is China's claims in the South China Sea, which Vietnam knows about, and the second one is Taiwan. This afternoon, there was a very important election in Taiwan. I haven't seen the results yet, but we're going to be getting them any time now. And if Lei, who's the representative of the Democratic Progressive Party, who now is the ruling party, if he wins, there's a danger he's going to declare independence. If he declares independence, then China will militarily try to seize Taiwan. If that happens, the United States policy officially is supposed to be strategic ambiguity, not saying what we're going to do. But Joe Biden 4 times has said the U.S. will send troops to help Taiwan. If that happens, it's World War III. The Pentagon has done 18 war games about a war between the U.S. and China over Taiwan. China has won all 18. So there's no guarantee that the U.S. could even win if it sends troops and bombers and ships to the Taiwan Strait. But my fear is between Ukraine and Taiwan and Gaza, the world is exploding right now. It gets so much more dangerous and could lead to nuclear war. And so that's my real fear. Because, I don't want to let Tom talk, but we have the theory called nuclear winter. It goes back to the 1980s. American and Russian and other scientists developed this idea that if there's a nuclear war, the cities will burn. It will send so much smoke and soot and debris into the stratosphere. Within 2 weeks, that will circle the stratosphere and block the sun's rays from hitting the earth. It will destroy much of the agriculture and could lead to ending all life on the planet, at least all large life on the planet. The recent studies show that if there was a limited nuclear war between India and Pakistan, which 100 Hiroshima-sized nuclear weapons were used, that could block enough of the sun's rays to kill 2 billion people. That's 100 Hiroshima-sized nuclear weapons. The reality is we've got 14,000 nuclear weapons, and they're between 70 and 70 times as large and powerful as the Hiroshima weapons. So if even a fraction of those were used, it could mean the end of life on the planet. And so that's why we can't have wars anymore. But the leaders don't know that, don't act that way. So Xi Jinping wants to make China great again. Biden wants to make America great again. Modi wants to make India great again. Putin wants to make Russia great again. But nobody speaks for the planet. So while the planet is burning, as Guterres, the head of the United Nations, said, the planet is burning and we're fighting over stupid things. And so we're in a very dangerous moment in history. And that's what I give a lot of talks about and warn about.
Thank you. So Peter vừa mới đưa một câu trả lời khá là dài cho cái câu hỏi về tình hình thế giới nhìn chung hiện nay và cái mối nguy dẫn đến một cuộc chiến tranh lớn rộng khắp, thì nó đến từ rất nhiều những cái nền tảng. Cái sự căng thẳng nó ngày càng tăng dần đều, từ cái mâu thuẫn giữa Nga với Mỹ từ năm 90, với cái việc mà NATO và Nga liên tục tranh giành nhau và Mỹ liên tục có thể sự gây hấn với lại ở bên Nga. Và sau đó đến 2011 khi mà Hillary Clinton đã tuyên bố về cái việc Mỹ sẽ chuyển cái trọng tâm từ Trung Đông sang châu Á để ngăn chặn cái sự phát triển của Trung Quốc vào năm 2011, thì có thể coi là Mỹ đã mở thêm một cái chiến tranh lạnh thứ hai nữa với Trung Quốc. Và với cái sự mong muốn ngăn chặn sự phát triển của Trung Quốc về phía Nam ở Biển Đông, thì cái vai trò của Đài Loan mà hôm nay thì đang có cái cuộc bầu cử, nó thể hiện một cái tầm quan trọng, khi mà nếu như mà Đài Loan tuyên bố độc lập và Trung Quốc quyết định hành động để mà chiếm và để thống nhất thì Mỹ có thể sẽ có thể quyết định gây chiến và chiến tranh thế giới thứ ba sẽ diễn ra. Thế nhưng mà Mỹ thì trong suốt thời gian qua đã tổ chức khoảng 18 cuộc chiến ở Đài Loan với Trung Quốc, những cuộc chiến về chính trị, về kinh tế thì hầu như đều thua Trung Quốc cả. Thì không biết là nếu như mà họ quyết định thực hiện cuộc chiến quân sự thì có lẽ cũng không chắc là có thắng hay là thua. Thì đấy là những cái mối nguy hại khi mà chúng ta không biết được kết quả chúng ta đạt được là gì, nhưng mà những hành động, những quyết định được đưa ra thì vẫn có vẻ không có quan tâm đến những cái mối nguy hại, mà đặc biệt đấy là mối nguy liên quan đến môi trường và đến trái đất. Khi mà nếu như cuộc chiến hạt nhân nổ ra thì chắc chắn là sẽ gây nguy hại rất là lớn, giữa việc là ô nhiễm, có thể là có một thuật ngữ liên quan đến nuclear winter, mùa đông hạt nhân, là khiến cho cái khói bụi nó khiến cho mặt trời không chiếu vào được và có rất nhiều thực vật sẽ chết và động vật cũng chết theo. Đấy là cái mối lo, cái cảm giác lo mà Peter có hiện nay khi mà càng thấy cái rủi ro chiến tranh ngày càng lộ rõ. Tom, would you like to add something to the question? How do you feel about the current situation and the danger of a border war?
Right. Well, I appreciate hearing this from Peter because of his expertise and his lifelong study of this situation, and not just study, but taking action about this situation. And my perspective is more of a common person's perspective. I've, as an average person, did military service, had involvement with nuclear weapons that I abhorred the idea of, and was aware of just the terrible danger that we would ever even consider them, and often wondered myself what I would do if we were called in the case of these tactical weapons on board the submarine to use them. It was a very tough decision to struggle with when you're just an average person in the big military system. So I've always, followed a lot of what Peter has said through my lifetime, and always concerned and sharing that concern. I've met with a number of folks actively involved in work against nuclear proliferation, and had the opportunity to speak with them about that. Michael Clare is one contact, you know, Peter, that I communicate with, even though I'm just not an expert in the field. So, but I guess just to summarize, I can sense and feel all the things that Peter's talked about, and just confirm that it's a serious situation. And from, again, my perspective as a lay person, part of my fear is I don't think people realize enough how close we are to this terrible danger, and that situation could happen at any time.
And as a soldier, do you think that should all the country change the martial law, like the army, the law of the army, to treat soldiers as normal human beings rather than a killing machine to do whatever they are asked to do?
Yes, when I think about a question like that, I think when you look at what law says, what international law, look at law of war, and look at even what written U.S. military guidance is about that, and in addition to the Uniform Code of Military Justice, in theory, there are certain safeguards in place that if a war is conducted, it will be conducted in some sort of a just manner. I mean, you know, we hear about situations that we call atrocities that are violations of that kind of rules-based look at how fighting is conducted. And that's like one set of standards, but in reality, it's a very tribal situation. My experience in the military from kind of the base level of it is that your sole concern is engendered around the people you work with, and it's all about we'll do anything to stop anybody that's going to threaten us, and which leads to then this vilification of the enemy, of otherization of the enemy, of not really understanding it's all about my survival, and what I'll do anything to survive, in other words. So and then, of course, then the hierarchy in the military kind of pushes that thing, and I think we can very easily lose sight of what are the rules of warfare. And we see instances of that all the time happening. So, you know, the specific question, my focus on studying and research has been around the American prisoners of war in Vietnam. And an issue with them was that they didn't know how to act with respect to the Geneva Accords. And why didn't they understand how to act with respect to the Geneva Accords? Because they were held to another standard called the Code of Conduct, which started in genderized terms back then. I am an American fighting man. Even when I'm taken prisoner, I will resist. I will do all these things to carry on the fight, continue the fight. So many Americans, when their pilots shot down in prison of war, they just remember this code of conduct. But not too many of them were aware that for them to receive the protections of the Geneva Accords, there's one key criteria that needs to happen. They need to surrender. Not continue a fight, not be belligerent with their captors, not do all these other things. So even in the prisoner situation, we don't know how to train people the right way to behave according to a rules-based order that would afford them some protections as a prisoner of war. So it's like, I think, many things in life, here's what the rules say, but here's how it's carried out.
Thomas thì vừa mới đưa ra một câu, mình có hỏi Thomas là về câu chuyện liên quan đến vì ở đây Thomas là một người lính, trước đó là từng người lính, bây giờ nghỉ hưu rồi, nhưng mà người lính hải quân thì cũng liên quan đến cái câu chuyện là thế thì khi mà được ra lệnh phải khai hỏa hạt nhân thì phải làm thế nào, thì khi đóng vai trò một người rất là nhỏ bé trong cả một cái cỗ máy chiến tranh như vậy thì cũng sẽ rất lăn tăn trong cái việc là mình sẽ làm gì cho nó đúng. Thế thì mình có hỏi cái câu hỏi là liệu luật pháp quốc tế hay là luật quân đội ở các nước có nên thay đổi, là coi mỗi một người lính như là một con người bình thường chứ không phải là một cái người chỉ biết làm theo lệnh, là phải làm bất cứ điều gì theo yêu cầu. Thì Thomas có trả lời là cơ bản thì các bộ luật thì nó khá là, tức là cái luật nó khá rõ ràng, nó cũng khá là nhân văn. Có cái việc liên quan đến khi mà bị bắt thì mình có thể đầu hàng để được đối xử như một người bình thường theo cái hiệp định Geneva. Nhưng mà hầu hết thì trong thực tế, trong khi thực hành thì nhiều khi là họ sẽ bỏ qua những cái luật đó. Thực hành thì họ chỉ quan tâm đến việc là sẽ phải là tôi sống ông chết. Thì đấy là một cái điều khó khăn khi mà giữa thực tiễn và thực tế thì giữa thực tiễn và lý thuyết nó khá là khác nhau. Và chắc là phải bằng một cách nào đó để khiến cho mỗi một người lính có thêm những cái ý thức rõ hơn về lý thuyết, hoặc là họ phát triển thì họ mới có thể ra những quyết định mà nó phù hợp. Chẳng hạn như bây giờ mà những người lính được giao nhiệm vụ khai hỏa hạt nhân chẳng hạn, nếu mà họ đồng ý làm việc đấy thì nó sẽ là một cái rất là tệ hại đối với tất cả chúng ta. Nếu như mà may mắn, nếu như một người mà đúng lúc đấy, một người lính mà họ có cái lương tâm của chính họ thì có thể là họ sẽ không hành động. Okay, another question for Peter. When we look at a government expansion, can we identify whether it's a pro-war or pro-peace entity?
The government?
Yeah.
The U.S. government?
Any government.
Well, I mean, there are some people who think that a government, because they're based on force and a monopoly of force, are always military institutions. But there have been governments that at least govern in the interests of the people. When I look at the United States government, that's not often the case. Chuck is from Georgia. We have a former president from Georgia who's barely clinging to life now. That's Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was not a great president, but he's been a great ex-president. And in 2019, Jimmy Carter was speaking to a church congregation, and he asked them, he said, "I don't fear the Chinese century." He said, then he asked them, how many years has China been at war? How many wars has China fought since 1979? Since 79, since the Vietnam War. He said, China has fought 0 wars since 1979. He said, while my country, the United States, has been at war constantly. As a result, the U.S. has spent $8 trillion on the post-9/11 wars, while China has built, he said, 18,000 miles of modern railroad. The United States has 0 miles of modern railroad. He says American bridges are crumbling. American education system is very poor because we put all of our resources, or much of them, into war. He said that at that point, the 242 years of American history, the United States has been at war, he said, for all except 16 years out of 242 years. He said the United States is the greatest warmonger in history. You know who else had that view? Was Martin Luther King. In 1967, he said, the United States is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. So the United States has been involved in war after war after war. And that's very sad, because the United States should be providing a different kind of leadership. So when Oliver and I did our Vietnam documentary episode, we wanted to show that Vietnam was not an aberration, that Vietnam was not a mistake. So we start off in 1964 with the overthrow of the Goulart government by the CIA in Brazil. Then we talk about the U.S. military invasion of the Dominican Republic. Then we talk about the U.S. support for the Greek junta, the dictatorship in Greece. Then we talk about the U.S. support for the killing of 1 million people in Indonesia. Then we talk about Vietnam. Then we talk about overthrowing the Allende government in Chile. Then we talk about the U.S. support for the wars in Argentina against the people in Argentina. So we wanted to show that the invasion of Vietnam, as horrible as it was not an aberration. It was not out of the norm. This is what the U.S. was doing around the globe. I had Robert McNamara, the former Secretary of Defense, into my class as a guest speaker. And McNamara was the architect of the war. McNamara told my students, this was years ago, that he believes that 3.8 million Vietnamese died in the war. 3.8 million. That's an astoundingly high number. But when we were at the Diplomatic Academy a couple days ago, the ambassadors said that the figure now that Vietnam uses is 5 million. So everybody's upset about what's happening in Gaza. 24,000 people dead in Gaza, and that's terrible. And the world is shocked by it. But if you think of 24,000 compared to 5 million, I mean, that's a drop in the bucket. So with the United States, which is why the London Economist, the publication, said Biden tries to say this is a battle between autocracy and democracy. But to the world, it looks like a battle between autocracy and hypocrisy, because the United States should not be condemning Russia and Ukraine because look at America's history. And that's why the Global South has not gone along with American sanctions against Ukraine, because they see the hypocrisy.
Ok. Mình có hỏi Peter một cái câu về khi mà nhìn vào cái việc chi tiêu của một chính phủ thì chúng ta có thể nhìn được là nó là một chính phủ mà nó ủng hộ cho hòa bình hay ủng hộ chiến tranh. Thì Peter có trả lời là hầu hết chính phủ thì đều sẽ liên quan đến lực, tức là nó được xây dựng bởi cái lực, những cái vũ lực, nên là thường nó sẽ khả năng là nó thiên về chiến tranh. Nhưng mà cũng có một số chính phủ sẽ mang tính nhân đạo và vì người dân. Thế nhưng mà lấy ví dụ về chính phủ Mỹ thì hầu hết là, tức là cái tỷ lệ gây chiến nó hơi cao, và có thể coi là đối với Peter thì chính phủ Mỹ hiện nay chưa làm tốt được cái vai trò là một người lãnh đạo, mà hầu hết là đang đi gây chiến lung tung khắp nơi, và Việt Nam cũng chỉ là tình cờ rơi vào cái vòng gây chiến đó, cái chuỗi gây chiến nó diễn ra cách liên tục, và Việt Nam rơi vào trong cái vòng xoáy đấy. Mấy hôm trước thì ở bên Mỹ thì có ông Jimmy Carter, ông tổng thống khá là nổi tiếng, nhưng mà làm tổng thống không tốt lắm. Nhưng mà khi mà ông ấy làm cựu tổng thống, ông ấy hoạt động rất là mạnh mẽ, rất là nhiều hoạt động, và ông ấy cũng có chung cái quan điểm về chính phủ Mỹ trong cái việc đi gây chiến quá nhiều. Tương tự như hiện nay khi mà họ vẫn đang cố gắng khiến cho căng thẳng tại Ukraine leo thang, thì ở Gaza cũng leo thang, hàng ngày là mấy chục nghìn người chết. Và hôm nọ thì khi mà người Mỹ thì vẫn có một con số thống kê là số lượng người Việt Nam chết trong chiến tranh Mỹ Việt Nam đấy là khoảng hơn 3 triệu người chết. Nhưng mà phía Việt Nam thì hôm nọ bên Học viện Ngoại giao, bên đại sứ tham dự cái buổi trao đổi giữa các bác ấy với lại bên Học viện Ngoại giao thì tuyên bố là phía Việt Nam con số này là 5 triệu. Nếu mà con số 5 triệu này được thừa nhận thì người Mỹ sẽ thấy rất là hoảng hốt, rất là sốc. Bởi vì bây giờ thế giới đang sốc trước khoảng 20.000 người chết mỗi ngày ở Gaza, thì so với con số mà 5 triệu người dân Việt Nam chết trong chiến tranh nó là số rất là lớn, và nước Mỹ sẽ không dễ dàng chấp nhận được cái con số đấy. Và đối với Peter thì nước Mỹ có thể coi là hiện tại nó đang thể hiện một cái, có lẽ là cái tiêu chuẩn kép và nó hơi mang tính giả tạo, nó không làm tốt được cái điều nó nói. Thì đấy là quan điểm của Peter mấy hôm nay. So Peter, do you think that we will have in your book you talk a theme that runs through the whole book is American exceptionalism? Can you explain a little bit about that term?
American exceptionalism?
Yeah.
That's the idea that the United States is not only different from all other countries, the United States is better than all other countries. That God chose the United States to spread freedom and democracy. That other countries are motivated by greed or territory or geopolitics and power, But the United States acts in the world only to spread freedom and democracy. That's something that Americans learn from the time they're born, really.
And where does that come from?
That comes from when the Pilgrims, when the Puritans first landed in Plymouth, in Massachusetts Bay in 1630. Jonathan Winthrop gave a sermon in which he said that we will be like a city upon a hill. All the world's eyes will be upon us, and our experiment is going to change the world. Americans have always had that idea, that they are the city upon the hill. Ronald Reagan used to talk about that all the time. The shining city upon the hill, the example to humanity. So if people just do what we say, then the world will be enlightened and the world will be better. Which, you know, during World War II, the United States was on the right side. But since then, we haven't been. And the world we've created during the American domination, right now the richest 6 people on earth have more wealth than the poorest 4 billion people. What kind of world is that in which 6 people have more wealth than 4 billion people? It makes no sense. But this is the world that we've helped create, and a world where the United States has 800 military bases. Do you know how many bases China has? 1 official base in Djibouti. They have some islands that they've militarized in the South China Sea, but 1 real base. The United States is 800. The United States spends more on its military than the next 10 countries combined. And it used to be the United States spent more than the whole world combined. But the part of the problem is the U.S. is always feeding the military manufacturers. Back in 1961, President Eisenhower warned about the military-industrial complex. Well, he knew about it because he created it. And now, when Eisenhower became president in 1952, the United States had 1,000 nuclear weapons. When Eisenhower left office in 1961, the United States had more than 22,000 nuclear weapons. When his budgeting cycle was finished, the United States had 30,000 nuclear weapons. So he knew what he was talking about. But the world is just too dangerous right now, and it's gotten, just in the last 2 years, so much more dangerous than it was 2 years ago. So you people are young, and this is your future. Between global warming and climate change, poverty, one of the effects of climate change is the mass migrations. There are going to be 100 million people needing to move because the planet is getting too hot. What is going to happen with that? We saw when 1 million or 2 million people tried to move into Europe from Northern Africa a few years ago, it created fascist movements in Europe. If that's the effect of 1 to 2 million people, what's going to happen when 50 or 100 million people have to migrate? Parts of India are going to become uninhabitable. Parts of China will be uninhabitable. So the future, we've got to get a hold of our planet and change this before it's too late.
Thank you. Mình có hỏi về một cái khái niệm mà Peter có nhắc khá là nhiều trong cái cuốn sách Nước Mỹ Truyền Như Kể. Đấy là cái ý tưởng gọi là nước Mỹ xuất chúng. Cái nước Mỹ xuất chúng này là nó thể hiện khá là rõ và nó ăn sâu vào cái suy nghĩ của người Mỹ từ khi còn nhỏ họ được dạy. Thì cái ý tưởng này nó có nghĩa là người Mỹ là luôn luôn đúng, là được Chúa Trời trao cho lẽ phải và đi làm bất cứ điều gì là cũng tốt. Còn tất cả các nước khác, các dân tộc khác thì đều là nào là tham lam rồi thì rất nhiều tính xấu. Trong khi người Mỹ sẽ là một đất nước hào sáng chói, cũng như là được Chúa chọn và họ sẽ có quyền làm bất cứ một điều gì và nhưng mà luôn sẽ thể hiện được cái dạng là mang tới tự do, hòa bình, thịnh vượng cho thế giới. Thế thì nhưng mà với cái, tức là với một cái sự cái sự tùy tiện hành động như vậy thì họ cái lý tưởng là rất là lớn, nhưng mà thực ra là họ làm thì không tốt, khi mà chỉ tập trung chủ yếu dành cho xây dựng, cho đầu tư và vũ khí gây chiến. Trong khi đó thì rất nhiều những vấn đề khác liên quan đến giáo dục rồi thì môi trường thì sức khỏe thì họ không để ý nhiều, tức là không, cái ngân sách không dành cho những việc đấy nhiều. Và hiện nay thì Mỹ có khoảng tầm hơn 800 cái căn cứ quân sự trên toàn cầu, trong khi đó Trung Quốc chỉ có một cái. Thế nhưng mà Mỹ coi Trung Quốc đang là một cái đối đầu, thì có lẽ tất nhiên là họ cũng thấy cái tiềm năng, nhưng mà đâu đó có lẽ chỉ là một cái nguyên do hay là một cái cách để họ muốn viện cớ cho cái chính sách của họ để hiện tại được chuyển dịch sang châu Á. Thì đấy là ý mà Peter vừa mới chia sẻ, mình tóm lược một chút. So to talk about, I think that the global warming is very dangerous now. And how do you think that the world have recognized this situation, this problem? Tom, would you like to?
But how do you think what?
The global warming.
Mm-hmm.
Does all the country, does the world have recognized this issue yet? And
does the world recognize the issue?
The global warming?
Yeah. So, well, I don't believe to the extent that the world should recognize it. I just, as you asked, I was thinking more of the military perspective about it, that how it runs, and Peter's mentioned this, runs completely counter what we're trying to achieve in overcoming the effects of climate change, and how what a huge contributor to carbon emissions the U.S. military is, which is absolutely huge. That one cost. I was in logistics in the military, so I pay attention to some of these things that people don't pay much attention to. But we are providing diesel fuel for weaponry in Ukraine. That diesel fuel is getting to Ukraine flying in on C-17 aircraft. I mean, if you can think of what's the cheapest way to transport fuel and fuel oil, bulk in a tanker, through the Straits of Hormuz or someplace like that. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I'll just get to the point of the thing, is by the time a gallon of diesel fuel is delivered to put into a tank or an armored vehicle in Ukraine, it's over $600 per gallon for the fuel. But what we don't know is there's also a cost because of some things going on within the Ukraine military about what type of corruption is going on with that too, because some of them are now driving Mercedes. So something else is happening with that whole new economic opportunity, just this providing fuel for the military. That's just one anecdote, but the point is there's such a consumption of fuel, and the insidious part of it all is, like, you take the Gulf War, for example, or you take the invasion of Kuwait, for example. Just the clouds of billowing smoke and all that's released in the atmosphere when when bombing takes place, when things that are bombed then burn, and all the pollution there. Nuclear winter is thousands of times greater in scale, but when people design a bomb, an explosive, they don't design it and say, now, is this going to be ecologically harmful afterwards? Okay. What's contained in it? So there's all that contamination the explosives. We don't know the extent of all the contamination of that as well, just the residue of explosives. So, you know, I'm digressing from the question, but from one military perspective, all this activity is just certainly not doing our planet any good. Whether it's just the operations level and the operations tempo and all the fuel consumed in that, or you know, actually a warfighting situation of all the horrid pollution that takes place in that.
Okay. Mình có hỏi bác Tom về cái vấn đề nóng lên toàn cầu thì hiện nay đang được thừa nhận ở mức độ như thế nào? Thì bác Tom có nói là nó chưa đáng kể, và đặc biệt là trong bên quân đội thì bác là người lính, cho nên là khá để ý đến cái việc mà quân đội vận chuyển các thứ, thì sẽ thấy được là cái chi phí, tức là cái việc mà thải khí carbon, nói chung là cái việc thải ra gây hại cho môi trường ở bên quân đội nó siêu lớn. Ví dụ như cái việc là họ vận chuyển xăng từ Mỹ sang Ukraine bằng máy bay, tức là cái việc mà nó vừa tốn kém, nó vừa gây xả thải ra môi trường rất là lớn, trong khi thực ra thì nên chuyển những cái phương pháp khác nó tiết kiệm hơn. Còn chưa kể là tất cả những cái việc liên quan đến quân sự thì họ sẽ thường không quan tâm đến chuyện ảnh hưởng đến môi trường khi mà thiết kế, hay khi một hành động, một chiến dịch gì đấy, ít khi họ tính đến cái chi phí môi trường. Cho nên là nó có thể coi là cái tình huống hiện nay là tình huống nóng lên toàn cầu nó chưa hề được quan tâm một cách cụ thể. So I think that all these weapons and tools and you know have been made by the scientists and the engineer. What do you think about the scientists nowadays? How do they think about the global warming? Are they aware of it? Most of them are aware of that.
Scientists are very aware of global warming. The consensus among scientists is that we might be reaching the point of no return, that they wanted to limit the growth, the heat, to 1.5 degrees Celsius from the Industrial Revolution to now. Is that if it gets to 1.5 degrees, we're going to have to abandon certain parts of the world. It'll be too hot to live. Also, a lot of island nations are now underwater. We even see that in places like Miami, Florida, where certain parts of Miami are underwater every day now. So we're seeing a crisis globally. The scientists know that, but there's no political will. The political leaders, for example, what's going on in Ukraine now, is having a terrible effect on diverting attention for what needs to be done. It makes no sense that we don't look at it as a human species, that we look at it from parochial national interest. And from that standpoint, everybody wants to get an advantage. And so there's been no agreements and no serious action taken. We need a dramatic program around the world, led by the U.S. and China, to tackle global warming. And the U.S. and China are just not working together on very much right now. So that's why I don't know if we got the results. I know you checked to see about the results of the election. The results are in yet, but it's very consequential to see if, thank you, if that happens. If the DPP wins again in Taiwan. But we also have a very important election coming up in the United States. We've got important elections all over the planet this year that are also going to have a big impact on the future. I'm curious to know how it feels to people in Vietnam to look at the fact that they have little control over what the United States and China and England and Germany is doing right now, but it's going to affect people in Vietnam just as much as it affects people in China and India and the United States. This is all of our planet, but the people in charge are not viewing it that way. And so there's such a waste of money on killing, nuclear weapons. All 9 nuclear powers are modernizing their nuclear arsenals. It means making them more deadly and more efficient. The United States now, China, England are all talking about increasing the size. Since 1986, we had 70,000 nuclear weapons in the world. Now we got it down to under 14,000. But now it's growing again for the first time. We're going the wrong direction as a species right now, and that's what's so tragic and dangerous.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, I have a question. What's the motivation behind expanding nuclear weapon? Like, what's the drive? What are they trying to achieve in building more?
Well, the idea of deterrence is that if your nuclear arsenal is both big enough and it can survive a first attack, you want to have a second strike capability. China, for a long time, had a policy of minimal deterrence and had 200 nuclear weapons and said that that's enough to stop anybody. But now things have gotten so heated with the United States that they believe that if the United States attacks, they might not be able to respond. So they want to build up a second strike capability to deter a U.S. attack. The problem with deterrence theory is it works until the point when it stops working, and then there's nobody left alive to tell them they were wrong. So we're trying to prevent war by showing that we can wipe each other out. But wars start usually by accident. When you look at World War I, nobody wanted to go to war in World War I over the assassination of Archbishop Ferdinand, you know, but they had these alliances. So something could start. The United States sends freedom of navigation operations through the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait. It says we can do that, they're international waters. But we've almost collided several times with Chinese vessels there. All it takes is an accident of that sort, or an accident over Taiwan, or there's so many other places. Putin threatened nuclear war over Ukraine. That's just as dangerous and crazy as what the U.S. is doing. So if there's something happens over Taiwan and the U.S. is not able to defeat China, which is possible, then will the U.S. resort to a tactical nuclear weapon? Or if Putin was losing over Crimea, this Russian strategy is to escalate to de-escalate, to use a tactical nuclear weapon to show how serious they are, thinking the other side's going to back down. But what if it doesn't back down? You know, so there's all these calculations, and the people in charge should not have the ability to end life on the planet. That's why we should get rid of all nuclear weapons.
Do you reckon it's possible?
Possibly yes. Probable no. But you're young. You guys have got to fight for that world. You know, and Vietnam knows the history of war and how horrible war is. Vietnam can be providing real leadership. I don't look to my government. I see Biden came to office with 18 top advisors from the Center for a New American Security. These are all China hawks. These are the ones who are behind the Asia pivot in 2011. And you wonder why is Biden going along with Trump's policies over China and Russia and other places? You look at who his advisors are, and it's not a surprise.
Thank you, Peter. Giờ mình tóm tắt một chút cho một số bạn. Thứ nhất là cái vấn đề hiện nay thì tức là cái việc liên quan đến nóng lên toàn cầu cũng như là việc các chính sách chiến tranh ấy, thì có lẽ là nó sẽ bị lệ thuộc vào cái vấn đề chính trị. tức là nó phải được giải quyết bằng những cái ý chí chính trị. Mà cái ý chí chính trị đấy thì hiện nay ở Mỹ thì Peter không có niềm tin lắm, bởi vì 18 người cố vấn của ông Biden khi mà được nhậm chức thì đều là những người mà có chủ trương cứng rắn với Trung Quốc, tức là họ sẵn sàng gây hấn với Trung Quốc. Thế nhưng mà với cái sự các cái mâu thuẫn đang ngày càng tăng thì tất cả các nước đều tập trung vào việc là gia tăng cái số lượng đầu đạn hạt nhân, gia tăng đầu đạn hạt nhân, bởi dựa trên một cái lý thuyết đấy là nếu như mà có đủ số đầu đạn hạt nhân để mà phản công khi mà một bên nào đó tấn công trước, nếu như mình có thể gọi là sống sót và có thể phản công được lại, thì họ sẽ cảm thấy an toàn hơn, tức là có cái sự chắc chắn hơn. Thì bằng cái tư duy như vậy nên tất cả các nước đều đang muốn gia tăng cái số đầu đạn hạt nhân lên, để làm sao để đảm bảo là tôi sẽ sẵn sàng đáp trả ông nếu như ông đánh tôi. Với cái tư duy như vậy thì nghĩ rằng là bên người ta không ai dám tấn công mình. Thế nhưng mà tất cả những cái tính toán đó đều có thể dẫn đến một cái điểm ấy là tự nhiên có một cái ngòi nổ, và rồi thì cuối cùng là các bên sẽ đáp trả nhau. Bởi vì như Thế chiến 1 thì hầu như không muốn chiến tranh, nhưng mà tự nhiên có một cái tình huống nó dẫn đến cái việc nó giống như domino, thì là mọi thứ nó sẽ không có điểm dừng. Khi mà một cái sự cố gây ra và dần dần mọi người đáp trả nhau thì nó dẫn đến sự hùng đó.
Can I add a little bit to that? Back in 2002, the United States abrogated the ABM Treaty, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, because we wanted to do our ballistic missile defense. And so Russia responded by modernizing its nuclear arsenal. In 2012, the United States and Russia signed the New START Treaty. In order to get Congress to approve it, Biden had a promise to modernize the nuclear arsenal. $1 trillion over 30 years of the U.S. nuclear arsenal. It's now up to almost $2 trillion. In response, on March 1st, 2018, Putin announced that Russia now has 5 new nuclear weapons, all of which can circumvent U.S. missile defense. Since then, we've gotten rid of all the treaties. Not only the ABM Treaty, but the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, Trump got rid of. The JCPOA, the Japan Nuclear Deal, Trump got rid of. The Open Skies Treaty, Trump got rid of. And the only thing that was left was the New START Treaty. When Biden came to office, he renewed the New START Treaty for 5 years. Now, Russia and the United States, neither of them is abiding by the New START Treaty because the relation is so tense over Ukraine. So there are no nuclear treaties left between the United States and Russia. So that's why we have a new arms race. And all of the 9 nuclear powers are modernizing, and most of them are expanding. It's very, very dangerous.
Tất cả các cái hiệp ước về hạt nhân thì hiện tại đều đã bị loại bỏ. Tức là các nước gần như bây giờ không ràng buộc với nhau về chuyện, và vì thế nên là số đầu đạn hạt nhân ngày càng tăng ở mỗi một bên của một nước. Thế thì với cái tình huống như vậy thì Peter cho rằng là thế giới cũng đang trong tình trạng khá là nguy hiểm, và nó cũng sẽ ảnh hưởng đến tất cả mọi người, kể cả là Việt Nam. Thì rất hy vọng là có thể nhận được những cái quan điểm hay suy nghĩ của các bạn có mặt hôm nay ở đây, khi mà trong cái tình huống như thế, tức là với những cái quyết định của các chính phủ Mỹ hay Anh hay Trung Quốc hay là Nga, các quyết định đó dù mình không thể tác động được đến cái quyết định của họ, nhưng mà các quyết định của họ sẽ ảnh hưởng đến mình. Thế thì chúng ta có suy nghĩ gì và có tò mò hay thắc mắc gì không? Có thể trao đổi cùng với hai tác giả này.
Yeah, actually, I may have a question. I just write down a little bit because it's quite complicated, right? So all of us know that the U.S. has held the most comprehensive and solid power in every aspect after the World War II, right? It's obvious. in decades ago, we know the Cold War between the U.S. and Soviet Union. I think it's because Americans believe that the Soviets may make some threats to the power and benefits of the U.S. But after that, nothing happened, right? And now, you say about the second Cold War between the U.S. and China. Because China, after 3 decades of fast growing, they are expanding their power to Asia, and then especially in Southeast Asia. And China have its own dream, Chinese dream, right?
Yeah.
So compare Chinese dream to American greatness. How do you think about that, and how do you think about the political pressure, especially in the South Asia, can bring some, at least I think about some local wars in the China Sea, in Taiwan, or some may happen in between the South and the North of Korea. Yeah, that's it quite complicated. I mean, in the South Asia, APAC is very complicated. And how do you think about that? I think small countries like Vietnam, Taiwan, Korea, Southeast and South North and South Korea, maybe that's more nations. We have a very big pressure between the two big countries, China and the U.S. What do you think about that?
Do you want to say that in Vietnamese in case some of the people don't speak English?
I think I have a set of anyone.
Ok, I can translate. Anh Thuật đấy có đặt câu hỏi cho Peter muốn giải thích một chút về cái mối căng thẳng, cái cạnh tranh giữa hai siêu cường là Trung Quốc và Mỹ hiện nay, thì nó sẽ ảnh hưởng như thế nào đến các nước nhỏ như là Đông Nam Á hay là Hàn Quốc hay là Đài Loan. Bởi vì là Trung Quốc cũng có một cái ước mơ gọi là Trung Quốc vĩ đại, Mỹ thì cũng có một cái là Mỹ xuất chúng. Thế thì nó sẽ dẫn đến tình huống như thế nào với các nước nhỏ thế này. Okay.
I think he might need an English translation.
Would you do you
Yeah,
Like a summarization, because it's a pretty long question.
you got the question?
I think so.
Yeah. So I think in my experience, the one thing is how the competition between U.S. and China can cause some impact, maybe bad or good, on Vietnam, on Southeast Asia, and a small country in the South Asia.
Yeah, well, as you know, China has had conflicts with Vietnam and with the Philippines, and the Philippines took China to court, and the Philippines prevailed, so they won. I mean, China suffered what it called the century of humiliation, beginning with the Opium Wars, and then the conquest by Japan, and the slaughter by Japan, and then the fight with the Kuomintang. So China was a very poor country, but what we've seen is this extraordinary growth. So for a long time, the Chinese strategy was to bide their time and not make waves. But more recently, China, which has a proud history also, thinks that its time has come. And the United States, it says, is a declining power. So they see the United States as a period of relative weakness. And when Trump was in office, the United States alliances with its former allies were weakened. So China thought then that this was their opportunity. And they made close friendship with Russia. Russia has not done well militarily. Russia, though, has the biggest nuclear arsenal in the world, and its nuclear weapons are very good. At the same time, they were predicting that China's economy would surpass the American economy by 2030 or 2033. So China felt like it was entitled. And when Wang Yi and Yang Jiechi met in Anchorage, Alaska in March of 2021 with Anthony Blinken and Sullivan, the Chinese said, so Blinken made a 2-minute talk. That's what they were supposed to do. But then Yang Jiechi spoke for 15 minutes and said, you are no longer can speak to China from a position of strength. Look at what you've done, all these wars, all this devastation you've created. And they began what they called the wolf warrior diplomacy. And they tried to be very aggressive. And that's what I think we're seeing in the South China Sea now. And it's very unfortunate, because if you listen to Xi Jinping, he talks about win-win diplomacy. And that's the right idea. But he doesn't exercise that toward Vietnam or to the Philippines or to the other countries in the region. And so I hope the Chinese are rethinking that. There is enough wealth in the South China Sea for Vietnam and the Philippines and China. And so China should not do the way the United States did. Should not be so aggressive and try to dominate, because it's going to backfire. And what it's doing in the South China Sea is it's making countries like Vietnam much friendlier toward the United States. So when I do a lot of Chinese television, and I always say to them that their approach is the opposite of what it should be in China's interest. That if China was friendlier and more sharing and cooperative with its neighbors, then the United States would not be able to gain a toehold in the region. And so that China needs to rethink its policies. I meet with the officials of the Chinese embassy in Washington. I also meet with the Russian ambassador, Antonov, the ambassador to the United States, and other people also. And I try to talk to them. I try to talk the Russians into stopping the fighting in Ukraine. I try to talk the Chinese into a very different approach toward the South China Sea and other countries I'm working with, because we need people to think differently about the planet and about sharing the planet and sharing the resources. And China I've been very critical of China's approach. And I hope that they do come to a different understanding. I can understand to some extent why they see the world this way now that they're so strong, but I hope that they've learned different lessons.
Yeah, I actually a little bit more, you know.
Do you want to let Nam translate before?
No, for the others, if you want to just say.
Just for some of the people.
Theo quan điểm của Peter thì Trung Quốc hiện nay nói chung là cái quá trình cái thời gian vừa qua thì Trung Quốc đã bắt đầu thể hiện một cái có thể coi là nghĩ rằng là Mỹ đang yếu dần, nên là Trung Quốc muốn thể hiện mình cũng có thể đang trỗi dậy, nên là trong những cái cuộc gặp ngoại giao với Mỹ thì Trung Quốc đã thể hiện những cái quan điểm khá là cứng rắn và họ muốn chứng tỏ mình cũng ngang hàng hay là có thể vượt trội hơn so với Mỹ. Thế nhưng mà cái cách tiếp cận, tức là cái hướng tiếp cận của Trung Quốc đối với khu vực Đông Nam Á chẳng hạn, với lại Philippines hay Việt Nam, thì theo quan điểm của Peter là nó chưa, tức là nó có lẽ là nó đi ngược lại với lợi ích của Trung Quốc, lẽ ra chúng có nên làm. Bởi vì Tập Cận Bình thì luôn luôn có quan điểm là hai bên cùng thắng, win-win, nhưng mà cái cách của Trung Quốc ở Đông Nam Á thì luôn mang tính áp đặt với lại các nước nhỏ, và đó là một cái cách mà theo Peter thì nó lại cũng giống cái cách cái gọi là cái vết xe cũ là thất bại của Mỹ. sau khi Trung Quốc nên có cái hướng tiếp cận hợp tác hòa bình cùng phát triển, thì có lẽ là Mỹ sẽ không khó mà có cơ hội can thiệp vào Việt Nam hay là Philippines để mà lôi kéo về phía Mỹ để cân lại với Trung Quốc. Thì đấy là một số những cái ý chính mà Peter vừa chia sẻ.
No, but one up from me and maybe some Vietnamese people. Of course, we know that China is the only nation in South Asia who own the nuclear weapon, right? So that's a big thing we may consider in some crisis. But is the U.S. really interested? I mean, the core interest of U.S. in the South China Sea. So I mean about the pivotal strategy made by Clinton and the following president in the U.S. Are they really interested to have some benefit or impact in Southeast China Sea, or just to show up? When China, you're not a big guy.
The Americans in 1990, leading neoconservative thinker Charles Krauthammer said, "This is America's unipolar moment. The United States is the only superpower left after the Soviet Union collapsed, and he said the United States will dominate the world for the next 30 or 40 years, and there'll be no rivals." In 2002, after the U.S. invaded Afghanistan, but before Iraq, Krauthammer said, "I was wrong. This is not the unipolar moment. This is the unipolar era, and it's going to last indefinitely, maybe hundreds of years. Nobody can ever challenge the United States." But then things went so badly in Iraq and Afghanistan that in 2006 he said, "Well, the unipolar era is over and the unipolar moment is coming to an end," even Krauthammer. The problem is American policymakers want to dominate the world. They want to believe that the United States is the only superpower, and they are committed to not letting anybody else develop who could challenge the United States. Why is the U.S. so concerned about Ukraine? Zbigniew Brzezinski, former National Security Advisor to Jimmy Carter, a top policymaker, wrote a book in 1997 called The Grand Chessboard. And what he says there is if without Ukraine, Russia will never be a Eurasian superpower. If we can break Ukraine away from Russia, then we can always make Russia weak and ineffectual, essentially. And the United States is able to do that now in building up Ukraine. But China emerged so quickly and so powerfully that the United States, what Xi Jinping accused the United States of, is suppression, domination, and containment of China. So the American strategy during the Cold War toward the Soviet Union was what we call containment policy, not to let it expand and grow. The same thing is happening now toward China. So the U.S. wants to contain China. In terms of the South China Sea, the U.S. has important trade routes for everybody, but it's in China's backyard and Vietnam's backyard. The United States is thousands of miles away, but the United States views anything that happens anywhere as a threat to the United States. And it's unfortunate, because the United States then, anytime anybody is making headway anywhere that threatens U.S. domination, the United States views that as a threat. And that's why we have bases everywhere and spend so much on the military, so we can intervene everywhere. The United States is the only country that can project its power everywhere on the planet. Land, sea, space, cyberspace, and outer space. All 5 realms. the United States wants to dominate and is willing to spend our tax dollars to do so.
So for me, actually, we don't think we have a permanent enemies or permanent friends. All the things benefit, especially for small country like Vietnam. So how to deal with the big guys in the world, especially in Southeast China. China Sea is very complicated, and yeah, for me, I don't know, but the only thing I know is try our best, to develop the economics and then make friends with everyone in the world. That's sure.
Well, that's smart. That's why I was just on Vietnam television 2 days ago. I was on Lena's show, and I was saying that Vietnam should be careful not to be drawn into the United States strategy against China. That Vietnam should be neutral and be friends with both sides and use them to Vietnam's advantage. You know, I'd like to see Ukraine become neutral.
Yeah,
But it doesn't have to join NATO. It'd be good if it joins the EU. If it wants to, that's fine. It can have economic relations, but it should not be in one bloc or the other. And China and Vietnam and nobody, it doesn't. When I look right now, for example, at Bahrain, Bahrain is the only Arab country that's supporting the U.S. operation in the Red Sea. That's very dangerous. The U.S. now has bombed Yemen, the Houthis, twice. That could, you know, Hezbollah in Lebanon could get involved. We already have attacks going on from militias in Syria and Iraq. So it's not just Hamas, that whole region could explode. And that's what people should be afraid of, is a broader war, a regional war. And does China get involved? Does Russia get involved? Does Iran get involved? I mean, Iran is a major player. And so it's got all of these militias in the region. If the Israelis think that what happened on October 7th was terrible, it's not compared to what might happen if there's a regional war, because everybody has such advanced weapons now. It's not like 67 or 73. It would be much, much more devastating for everybody.
Thank you. Chúng ta, em muốn hỏi.
So we are students. We currently studying in Faculty of International Studies in Hanoi. I think Tom Wilber,
Good to see you.
used to teach it. And actually, this morning we learned about Asian studies.
This morning you learned about what?
Asian studies, about Asia. So our teacher gave us a question that will there be Asian century? And most of us discuss and say that there would be. But for me, I think that there would be not, because if we consider China as the representatives in Asia to compete with the US, the technology and also the military power, they would take a longer time to compete. But then our teacher said that if we want to consider the question, we have to consider that that country have the will and the power to take over the first place, the sole superpower place. So can you tell us your opinion on whether there would be an Asian centuries?
You take this.
So, well, I've been following China as just in my work life for quite some time. In that one part of my career, I spent a lot of time working in China, and it began in early 2003, and so witnessed a lot of this year over year, 8+% GDP growth, for example, and saw that whole thing rise, and a few hiccups, but just the massive expansion of their economy and the massive expansion of what they were doing with their infrastructure. I would travel through airports and take high-speed rail all over China and come home and it's like, oh my gosh, how terrible the infrastructure is in the United States and how bad these airports are, and I can't even get on a train anywhere. But there's a very short primer book that came out last year in the U.S. called Washington's New Cold War. And in it, there's a chapter that describes that what's been happening all this time since we've been the sole superpower, or since we've had this moment which has become very short-lived in terms of being this unipolar world, is that the U.S. has just massively increased its defense spending, and the economy has grown, but at the same time, by non-traditional measures, which you could, if you applied a set of non-traditional measures to both China and the U.S., you would see how China is beating the U.S. in every aspect of scale. So whatever's left in the U.S., sure, GDP, that's one measure. But there are a bunch of measures, and you look at our manufacturing capability within the U.S., all of these things that are now hollowed out of the United States, and China has expanded in all these measures as well. Their economy is far much more sustainable than ours is, because the only thing we're growing is this massive military industrial complex. And the concern is that what we're actually, there's this hidden masked state of massive decline in the United States. So I remember studying when we thought that when China took the #2 spot in terms of biggest economies in the world, that then The Economist magazine was saying in 2050 we would see China overtake and become the greatest economy in the world. Now it's right coming real soon. So I've always wondered what would be the change when China reaches that state, when we start trading in the yuan instead of RMB instead of the dollar. And that's starting to happen too, with China funding a lot of things through the Belt and Road Initiative. So it's going to be, the only thing I can see is it's going to be a very sobering time for America when Americans realize we aren't #1. But again, kind of my person on the ground perspective of things.
What do you think though about we're living in an knowledge economy, right? And it's less about the manufacturing power and more about technological power. And the US right now is still attracting a lot of talents and technologically speaking.
So where is the talent being sourced from? How much of the talent is being grown up within the U.S. through its school system and academic system, which are not in a very good state, versus how much does the U.S. import all the time? I think there's a lot of advanced work in the knowledge economy that's taking place outside of the United States of America.
The U.S. used to attract talent from all over the world. But the U.S. is not very hospitable anymore. People around the world see the guns in the United States, the mass killings in the United States. It doesn't look safe anymore. There's a real possibility that Donald Trump is going to get reelected. He's made very hostile to especially Muslims, but foreigners, immigrants. We've got a nativist element in the United States that's ugly, not welcoming. And so, for example, all the Chinese students that used to be there, they're not feeling welcome in the United States now. I'd love to see more Vietnamese students. One of my favorite PhD students, Win from Ha Long Bay, was supposed to join us on our trip, but she got sick. So, but she now teaches at University of South Alaska. She's terrific. She wrote a great PhD dissertation about the Vietnam people's diplomacy during the war. Very important scholarship. So I don't see the United States as being as attractive a destination for the talent in the world as it was. And that's too bad, because the American university system used to be fabulous, but there's been an attack on education and intelligence, really, in the United States for decades now. So the United States is not what it was. I would like to see, imagine if the United States and China and Russia and India and Germany and Brazil were working together to make this a better planet. You know, that's what we should be doing. And sometimes when I do interviews, I say we need a summit meeting. We need the leaders of all those countries and others to get together and to sit down and figure out what to do about this planet to save it. There's no leadership along those lines now, but hopefully that's the direction we're going to go. Otherwise, this planet could be doomed. You know, there's studies, the UN studies on the climate are terrifying.
Thank you.
Do you know about the bamboo philosophy of Vietnam diplomacy? Right? How do you think about that?
Tell me.
Bamboo diplomacy.
Because you just told we don't follow China. You also don't follow the US. We are Vietnam. We stand alone.
Good.
But we stand here, but we don't want to be alone.
And the wind blows in Vietnam, the bamboo moves around.
Yeah. Whichever way the wind is blowing, I'm going that way.
Okay. But yeah, sorry. I have two questions. First one is India is trying to be the next economic superpower in the next 20 years. Do you think that is feasible, possible? And the second one is that some people think that right now China economy is a mess, is broken down, a lot of crisis, and a lot of China international initiative is not very successful right now. So in the near future, China will focus more on their domestic economy and attracting more foreign investment instead of making wars. What do you think about that?
Well, on the first question of India, I did 3 speaking tours across India in the 2 years before COVID. Have you ever been to India?
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating country. It's a very young country like Vietnam. The poverty is overwhelming. You go into a middle-class neighborhood, you go 1 block away, and there are people living on the street. There's still not a lot of indoor plumbing, and it's still, in many ways, very, very backward, but very dynamic. The population now is bigger than China's population in India. So I see India having tremendous potential. And I don't like Modi's policies. I don't like his Hindu nationalism. So I'm not a big fan of the Modi government, but I think India has got tremendous growth potential. And a lot of countries are trying to break their dependence on China, if not decoupling, at least de-risking, by diversifying their supply chains. So some of the manufacturing that was going on in China is moving to India, some of it's moving to Vietnam. And China, so I see India's got tremendous potential. China does have problems. The population is getting older. The growth rate has slowed down a lot. The Belt and Road Initiative, which seemed to pose an alternative to the dollar-based, the World Bank and the IMF spent over $1 trillion on development projects, but a lot of countries got too much debt and weren't able to repay it. So that has slowed down also. But there's also the BRICS countries, initially Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. But now 6 more countries, including Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, are going to be joining. And that's posing an alternative to the dollar-based international system. So I think people are beginning to look for alternatives. China has some real problems, as you're suggesting, but I think the potential for growth is still much greater in China than it is in the United States. And so even though it didn't recover very well from COVID, and many of its policies were self-defeating, I think China learns from those mistakes. And Xi Jinping, I mean, one of my problems is that all of these leaders think that they have to be in power forever. So Xi Jinping thinks China's going to fall apart without him, and Putin wants to be in power forever, and Biden is very unpopular. Even among Democrats, they don't want to see Biden run again, but he's clinging to power there. And Netanyahu, of course, won't let go of power there. And so you see this problem everywhere. So we need fresh leadership and new thinking right now. If there's some, China doesn't look like it's going to be having new thinking, but I think China is going to be still, you know, we talk about the Pacific century, you know, the Asian century. Clearly the economic growth and dynamic is in Asia, but we're going to see a lot of growth in Africa. I mean, Africa is also has tremendous potential right now. That's just barely being developed. China is doing a much better job in Africa than the United States is. And China's got much greater economic relations with most of Africa. And it's the leading trading partner for not only Vietnam, but every country in Asia right now. So I think the center is shifting away from the United States and Europe and moving toward increasingly Asia and Africa. But I don't want to see the United States and Europe excluded. I want to see them play a positive role in developing global green economy globally, because the United States still has tremendous economic power that should be used for good rather than for destruction.
Thank you, Peter. Do anyone else have any other questions? So while you are thinking about the question you may have, can you and Tom, if there is one advice that you can give to the young Vietnamese, what would it be? Like what if you were younger, 20 years old, what would you do differently in this situation now?
I was going to say, how far are we from 20? Can you think back? I can't think back.
50 years ago.
So I'm 50 years from 20. Let's say it that way. So if I were in my 20s, but I think it's also, I maybe characterize it from the audience perspective here as well, is that I think a 20-year-old in Vietnam could have maybe a similar set of opportunities, but in terms of how to face the issues or how to address the issues, the only thing I can think of on a personal basis is to keep going, keep striving toward these things. We all need to focus on these things, and to the extent that we can do what we can to move things in the direction in terms of, let's say, the climate, for example, we need to start practicing it. And that's so true of anything, is what's your practice. To me, it's so much of anything about change that involves one's practice. And if you want peace in the world, it starts with your own practice of peace and how you treat other people on a daily basis. I think, from my experience on Vietnam, I think you have that part down in terms of what I see and how people are treating each other. What I don't know is what type of, how can you implement some of the bigger opportunities and go after some of these bigger problems. And I think to the extent that as you're speaking about getting these countries together, I'm wondering maybe there should be a people's summit. Somehow we should get a people's summit together to start addressing this. Because, you know, what say do we have in any of this stuff? And is there a way we can start getting something moving along those lines? There's a lot of organization taking place among younger generations trying to face these issues. And the extent that people can start sharing information and educating each other and developing these kind of loose coalitions, I think that at least that's moving in the right direction. Probably a better, more maybe deeper answer here, Peter.
That's a great answer. I like that answer. I wish I had thought that answer. Wow. What can I say to a 20-year-old in Vietnam? You know, everything is possible. There is nothing stopping you from doing everything great with your lives. I'm very impressed with and motivated by being in this house, because there are books everywhere, and I like being surrounded by books. And I like that now is dedicating himself to the life of the mind and studying and looking at, if you look at his interest, he's interested in everything. And he's trying to bring that to people in Vietnam by publishing books like ours that might be difficult to get a hold of. And, you know, so I just say, study, but be optimistic. You know, approach it as if this is your world, this is your planet, this is your time. You know, and you've got these leaders there who are, for the most part, not representing what needs to be represented. You know, and, you know, approach it with a lot of love and patience and understanding, and also from the history of Vietnam, which has been invaded by country after country and survived and won and defeated France, the United States, China. And how many countries can say they've done that? So you have a very unique history and unique perspective, but you also understand the horrors of war. And so you have a voice and a kind of authority that most people don't have. And so don't think of yourself as being from a small, relatively powerless country. Think of yourself as being the voice of humanity. For example, I think the most important voice on the planet now, not in terms of influence, but in terms of message, is Guterres, the United Nations Secretary General of the United Nations. If you read his speeches, they're incredibly visionary and powerful. And he comes from, you know, a relatively small and powerless country. And yet he's got the message, because he's the one person who speaks for the planet right now. And so you can all be in that position. But you have to get a great education. You have to study history, understand history, and understand human potential, and understand that the world could be and should be much better than it is. That there's no reason why we've created such a fucked up world. You know, it shouldn't be, and don't accept that.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Nam, for doing this. This is fabulous. Thank all of you for coming. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Well, to me, the nuclear weapon issue is questionable. And thanks to you, I know it for the first time. So, I think not many people in the world know the very close danger of it as you do. So would you write a book on ordinary people in quite understandable terms, so that more of us as ordinary people can be aware of such a situation?
Thank you. But that is why Oliver Stone and I did the Untold History, and why we made our documentaries. Because the book is very scholarly, but the documentaries are for ordinary people. And 100 million people or more around the planet watched it.
100 million?
More, maybe.
Wow.
Because it played almost everywhere, not China. And I'm not sure if it played in Vietnam or not. But we should get it, because this was my effort, especially on nuclear issues, to educate people all over the world in a way they can understand. And Nam is going also to be publishing another book by me that's much simpler. This one, you know, is very heavy. You can't even barely lift it. The other one's going to weigh like this, very light. So, but simpler, and it's going to give a lot of that information, and less expensive. So I'm looking forward to all of you reading it, and then we could do Zoom events. I do Zoom talks all over the world, and I love to travel all over the world and meet young people all over the world. And my partner Oliver Stone wants to come back to Vietnam. So after our next book comes out, hopefully we can do that.
I want to
participate
in the Zoom calls. You can provide some information.
Sure.
Can I ask you only one question? I think that it's quite a little bit funny, because when I work, I am studying in international relations. My major is my major in my university, and when I discover or analyze about some problem related to some event around the world, and my teacher and my lecturer always say that, oh, you need to focus on some theory like realism, fascism, or liberalism to discuss and evaluate exactly. So I am always wondering and confusing that, is that practical or effective for me to discuss or evaluate some event in around the world, for example, like Russia, the invasion between Russia and Ukraine. And I always confusing that. And my teacher say that you need to understand the original, problem based on some theories from some figure like Karl Marx, Engels, or etc. to analyze it. So do you think that is it possible or effective for me and my student and our student to based on the theory to discuss an event like this?
the United States for a while, intellectuals were very much influenced by French theory, especially postmodernism and other theories like that. I don't think it was very useful. When I grew up, I studied a lot of Marxism. And it's not the strict interpretations, but it's the spirit of Marxism that I liked, the revolutionary idea. The early Marx, the Communist Manifesto, the economic and philosophical manuscripts, the German ideology, not the later Marx of theories of surplus value and Das Kapital. I thought that was limiting, but the spirit of it, but you don't need to study a lot of theory to understand or appreciate what's going on now. I think you trust your eyes, because you just look at the world and you think of how different the world could be. If you were going to design it, right, you're God, and you're starting it all over again, what kind of world would you make? Because one of the things I think we're missing is utopian spirit. In the United States, for example, people want to improve things, but they have a very limited vision. They think that the way the world is, it can't be very different. I think it could be completely different, and people could relate to each other in very different ways, and we could share the resources and the planet very differently than we do. So I think you have to dream, but I don't think you need a lot of theory to do that. I think it's in your heart and in your mind to see the kind of world we could create if we were able to start over and from a more humane standpoint. Right now we've got economies based on exploiting each other. Capitalism is based upon greed. I don't like a system that maximizes greed in order to get people, make people wealth at other people's expense. I like the idea of win-win, but I'd like to see it put into practice in a real way.
Okay.
But I'm very impressed with how good everybody's English is.
Thank
So,
you.
I don't